Everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar on interviewing tactics, putting your organization's best foot forward. My name is Mackenzie Keller with the CSG Pool, and I'm joined by Brian Haggerty, a project consultant with CPS HR. For those of you who don't know, CPS HR is a client-centered HR management and consulting firm that is going on 40 years of being a self-supporting public agency. CPS HR is a trusted partner for HR consulting and comprehensive HR solutions that drive advanced organizational performance. Our presenter, Brian Haggerty, is a seasoned HR professional with over 15 years of experience in compensation and classification in both public and private sector organizations. Today's webinar will teach you about how to prepare for a job interview as an employer, how to present yourself to potential candidates, and tips for leaving a lasting impression. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, you can put them in the chat so our presenter can see them, and we will also have some time for you to ask questions at the end. Without further ado, Brian, I will turn it over to you.
Hi, thanks, Mackenzie. I appreciate that. Welcome, everybody. So we're going to spend the time we have today talking about interviewing, talking about how to do this effectively, and I'm going to teach you how to interview so you always pick the right person and you never have a mishire. And if I could really do that, wouldn't that be amazing, right? I mean, that is the struggle, I think, for anyone who's ever been in the talent acquisition section is this is a hard thing. It's not an easy process. It's not easy for the employer. It's not easy for the candidates. And so what we're going to talk about today is trying to figure out how we can do this in the most effective way and hopefully in a way that's going to help us predict who's going to be a winner for our organization. So having said all of that, let me give you a little bit more about myself. I'm the Senior Compensation and Benefits Manager here at Metro Water Recovery here in Denver, Colorado. So I understand Colorado. I've been in the water industry for over 25 years. And it's one of those things that I think being in the public sector, working in this in special districts, you get a different appreciation for the hiring process and the things we have to do throughout that. So I come from the same place that you guys all are in currently. I'm a consultant and a trainer for CPS HR. I've been doing that for over 10 years. If you like what you hear today, you can always sign up for one of my HR analytics classes. I teach class and comp for CPS HR. I do their certification and exam class. So really focused on trying to help give tools to HR professionals in the public sector to be more effective. So that's really what I strive to do. And I've been in talent acquisition for over 10 years. When I first was hired at the Water District here in Denver, that was the reason they hired me. They thought that with my personality and my excitement that I would really be effective as a recruiter and be able to present the organization in a way that's going to attract people to want to come work for us. So that's a little bit about me. And if you want to know more, I'm sure I could tell you more and more. But we're not here to talk about me. Let's talk about what we're going to talk about. So anyone who's ever heard me talk at either a presentation, a webinar, or any of my classes, I'm always focused on data. Data is where I live and love. And so we're going to talk a little about what's going on in Colorado right now, because as we know, things are changing with the economy, and that's changing our labor pools and our ability to recruit. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on in Colorado. And then we're going to get into building that predictive interview process, how we're going to build a process that's structured, that makes sense, that's going to be easy for you to put into your organizations. And some of you may already have a lot of these things in place. And if so, hopefully you'll get some notes and some ideas on things that are going to help you be more effective at that. And then we're going to talk about optimizing that interview process, the branding, some of the things that you can do that's going to help you just clean up and make sure that we're presenting ourselves the right way to potential candidates. All right. So having said all that, let's talk a little about what's going on here in Colorado. And it's interesting because we are seeing unemployment. It's still at 4.2%, which is not incredibly high, but it has been on the rise. You can see this chart, and this all comes from BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, what's been going on in the labor pool with unemployment. You can see that spike that happened in unemployment during the pandemic, and then you can see the steep cliff as we all started ramping back up to get back on board, getting employees back in our organizations, and you can kind of see what's going on there. So currently we're at 4.2%. It was up as high as 4.8 in March, but it's kind of calmed down a little bit, but it's still you can see that it's gradually increasing. And that's obviously something that we want to be aware of. What's probably more alarming is that here in Colorado, separations are starting to exceed hiring. And that's a trend that we don't want to see. When we see that, that means that organizations are slowing down their hiring process and layoffs are starting to happen, which is a clear indication that we are, in fact, in a recession. And that is something that is going to impact our talent and our ability to hire, because as that recession happens, the economy is going to probably continue to slow down, which is going to make it more difficult as the dollars get tighter and tighter. So definitely some things that are happening here in Colorado, which is going to make it interesting, because anybody who's been in, talent acquisition over the last couple of years, it really has shifted from the employer having most of the power and the control, that there was a time there when employees, our candidates, had a lot more power, to counter offers, a lot more power to make demands in new positions, because it was so difficult to hire. But as that talent pool gets bigger out there, as people are getting laid off, it's going to decrease that power that they had and give some of that power back to organizations to be able to, when we're making our hiring offers and those kinds of things, we're probably going to see a little bit less of that resistance that we've seen over the last couple of years. So statistically, that's what's going on. And I don't think this is a big surprise to anyone here in Colorado. I think we all can feel what's going on with the economy and the labor market. So why is interviewing so important? Let's just kind of clear the air a little bit about this, because it is an important part of what we do. And probably the biggest thing is a lot of time and energy goes into the hiring process, between us screening applicants, creating job postings, reaching out to, different networking groups, time for interviews, all those kinds of things. A lot of time and energy goes into the hiring process. And that's one of the things that makes it so important. Next is, studies estimate that every mishire costs the organization somewhere between 5 to 27 times the employee's salary. And that's kind of alarming when we think about how much money, and this is one of those things that I do a lot of, is, all right, let's take numbers and actually turn them into dollars. Like, so how much is that really going to, every time we mishire, what does that look like? And if this was a class on analytics, I'd probably dive into that, and it'd be super exciting because you guys would get to do math, which I'm sure you all wish you could do on a Tuesday morning. But definitely, mishires definitely are costly, not just because of the salary, but it's disruptive to our employees. When we bring somebody into our organization, we say, hey, this is your new teammate. And then that person doesn't match with our culture. Maybe they're not productive. Maybe they, decide not to show up anymore. All those things create problems and angst in our employee groups. These people that they started to get to know, suddenly are gone again. They've been trying to keep up with, being shorthanded. They were so excited to have somebody here to do the work, and then it didn't work out. So mishires disrupt our employee groups and really impact our morale of our groups and our engagement. Because if we continue not to get it right when we're bringing candidates in to fill that spot, it only creates this feeling of frustration, despair going on in our employee groups, because they're already overworked. They're already shorthanded. So we definitely want to make sure that we are doing this as effectively as we can, because those mistakes not only cost on the bottom line when it comes to dollars, but also cost us when it comes to engagement and morale. And then lastly, it's demoralizing as a supervisor. It's every one of us that have ever hired someone, and this is one of those things I tell any hiring manager, there's always a time where you hired someone you were so excited about, you were so dead set that this person was going to be a superstar, and they turned out to be a total dud. And there's nothing more demoralizing when that happens, because you just feel like, wow, I really got this wrong. I don't know why I didn't notice, see these red flags, all those kind of things. But what I also tell hiring managers all the time is, there's going to be a time where you're going to hire someone that you're maybe not as excited about, that you weren't necessarily sure they were going to work out. Maybe you kind of felt like this was your last resort and this and that. And then they turn out to be really, really strong and really, really highly effective. And they really become a game changer for your group. So don't beat yourself up too much when you get it wrong, but also don't get too excited when you get it right, because it's really a thing where when we're out there interviewing and trying to bring talent in, we're doing the best we can to try to make sure we're bringing in the right people. All right, so let's talk about this predictive process about how we're going to build this so that way we're going to hopefully hit more home runs than strikeouts, right? So the steps to this are pretty simple, and that really comes down to what we want to do is we want to build structured interviews. And by this, what we mean is we want every candidate to be asked the same questions in the same order. And the reason we want to do that, there's a couple reasons here. The first reason is it's going to reduce the chance of bias and it's going to increase fairness, right? It's if we're asking every candidate the same questions, it doesn't feel like, hey, we gave Susie a pass because we really like Susie. And we really gave Marcus a hard question because, we're not really sure he's the right person for this. If everybody gets asked the same questions, it's a level playing field. And we want to do it in the same order so that way it feels consistent and it helps build that interview panels, their comfort level with asking the questions and listening to those responses. The second part of this is we can provide a copy of the questions and it'll assist the candidate in the interview. So, and what we do with this is, and I remember the first time I did this, I kind of felt like, all right, we're going to give you a quiz, but we're going to give you the answers to the quiz up front. Like it felt that way. But once I started doing it, I realized how effective this is. And that is, if you're doing in-person interviews, they come in, the questions are taped right there on the table, and you point them out to the candidate after you do your initial introductions. You say, hey, we're going to ask you 10 questions. The questions are right there in front of you. So please feel free to refer to them if you need to understand what we're asking about. And what that does is one, it stops that, oh, can you repeat the question? Because that happens all the time. Because candidates are nervous. They have all this nervous energy. They're worried that they're going to say the wrong thing. They're worried that you're going to hate them. All these things are going through their mind. And having the questions in front of them will help them kind of feel a little bit more calm, and it'll help them be able to refer to something. So when you ask them a question, they can look down at number 3, read it for themselves as they're processing how they're going to respond to that question. The other thing about providing those questions to your candidates is it's going to create in them a sense that, oh, this organization is treating everyone fairly. We're all getting asked the same questions. They're not trying to trick me with questions. And that's only going to ensure that they walk out of that interview with a better understanding of who you are as an organization, and hopefully be more excited about being part of your organization, understanding that fairness is something that's important. So when we do an interview, there's 2 kinds of questions we want to ask. The first one is the job-based questions. And these really are all about making sure that we're determining what the actual qualifications and skills of the candidate really are. These are job-based questions. These are things we're going to ask that are going to be focused on the duties of that role that we're trying to fill. The other type of questions are the behavioral questions. And these are really allow us as interviewers to kind of dig in and to understand some of the candidates' experiences, and hopefully based on how they responded in the past to certain instances will give us an idea of how they're going to perform in similar situations here in our organizations. So let's dig into these types of questions a little bit just to make sure we're clear on kind of how we can do this. So job-based questions, we're picking questions that are going to test the candidate's job knowledge. An example, explain how you would go about setting up a cloud-based data warehouse. So if we're talking to an IT person who's going to be working, building up our architecture or our systems, this might be a question where we want to find out really how they go about doing that. This is testing their knowledge, making sure they know what they say they know. Because we all know resumes, we all know applications, they can be misleading. So this is where we dig into that and really make sure that the candidates we're talking to really are qualified for the position. Another example, when digging a trench with a backhoe, what should an operator do to ensure safety, right? Anyone who's operated, heavy equipment knows what they need to do as far as safety parameters around operating that heavy equipment on uneven ground. So this is an easy question that anyone who has got the experience that I'm assuming they're reflecting on their resume and their application should be able to answer pretty in-depthly and assure you that they really do know what they're talking about. The other thing with job-based questions is we can do some cool creative things. And I've done a lot of this in the past. And that is we can create scenario exercises that will allow the candidate to demonstrate how they would complete tasks in the real life. And I'll give you a couple examples. Here in the water industry, we do a lot with SCADA, and we have to hire people that work and build these dashboards, like literal dashboards with gauges and dials. And so it's a little bit of an electrical background. It's an instrument background. It's a control system background. They're very interesting. And so when I was at the water department, they had built a box. And this box was a huge circuit board with all kinds of things. And I say things because I'm an HR person, not an electrician, right? And basically, we would go through the interview, and then the last part of the interview was this exercise. And we would say, okay, there are 10 things wrong in this system. As you correct them, you will see these lights light up showing that you've solved the problem. We just like, in Star Trek, where we're going to give you this scenario that you really can't solve. Same kind of thing in this instance. We would tell them, you're not going to get through all 10. We do not expect you to get through all 10. What we wanted to understand is how you went about solving these problems and what you discovered. And then we'd give them 15 minutes to work on this box. And it was always very interesting to see how they would do this. And then when we would ask them questions about it afterwards, it was really about, tell us how you solved number two. They would talk about that circuit board and what was going on and what they noticed and how they did that. Because what we're trying to understand is how they critically would troubleshoot the situation. And that would help us get a better understanding of how they would work as a control systems engineer in our organization. So really cool thing that our organization was able to do, and a really cool test to give candidates to really see their prowess as far as how they would solve things, how they would troubleshoot problems, that kind of thing. So another scenario we did was with an executive assistants. We were hiring somebody for an executive assistant to one of our department heads. And so the last part of this exercise, what I had done was I'd come up with a scenario. And basically, there was like a 4-page article. And what we told the scenario was based on, you need to read this article and you need to send an email to the director, letting them know what the key points are in this article, because they're about to walk into a meeting where there's going to be a discussion about this article, and they need to know what the key information that they need to be aware of. Something that an executive assistant would be expected to be able to do. And what it did for us is it allowed us to see this candidate. How did they critically think about this thing? How did they read this article and pick out the key talking points that their director would need to know? How are they going to write that email in a way that's going to be clear and concise that the director could read? We're checking grammar, we're checking spelling, we're checking all kinds of things are going on here. And it was a really good way for us to see how that candidate would accomplish this task, a task that they would be asked to do in their regular world. So, some really cool scenarios that you can build around job-based questions to really test the knowledge of that candidate, to really make sure that they do know what it is that we're asking. We had a meter reader position, and we asked them, all right, tell us, and it was just this simple, on your way here today, can you tell us the streets you drove on? And so anybody who knows Denver and knows streets and directions could walk us through how they got to the interview. And what we were testing there was we wanted to ensure that they knew their directions, they knew street names, they knew distances, some of those kinds of things. It was not a hard question, but it was just assuring us that if we're going to be sending them out onto the Denver streets, that they weren't going to get lost. Now, nowadays we have Google Maps, so it probably wouldn't have been as effective nowadays. But 20 years ago, that was pretty hard, right? So job-based questions, some scenarios you can build that are really going to help you identify the skills that these candidates have. So let's talk about behavioral style questions, because I remember when these really became the fad, 15 years ago, and everyone's like, oh, behavioral style questions, they're so good. And I'll never forget, we did an interview. It was all behavioral style questions. All they wanted to do was ask behavioral style questions. And the best part of the interview was, at the end of the interview, we asked the candidate, do you have any questions for us? And the candidate, and God bless them, it was such a clever thing. They immediately said, can you tell me about a time when, and we all like paused for a second, shocked that they were asking us a behavioral style question. And then we all started laughing because the candidate cracked up. But it was just a hilarious thing, because that's what, so much of our interviews nowadays are really focused on these. And there's a reason why, because behavioral style questions can be very, very effective. Really what we're trying to do is figure out how they're going to behave in the future. Okay. The other reason we do behavioral style questions is the culture ad. We're really trying to understand the attitude, the beliefs, the value that this candidate is going to bring into our organization. Are they going to fit in this work group? Are they going to, do they have the right kind of mind frame that's going to mesh with our employees and the culture of our organization? Next is communication skills. Effective communication is so critical in the workplace. And so being able to understand as they relate to us these stories, these experiences they've had, is going to help us understand how they communicate, how they give information, how they listen. So all those kinds of things are going to help us get a better understanding of the communication skills of the candidate. Problem solving. This is a big deal. Like in our jobs are complex. They're going to have to solve problems. How do they solve these problems? It's going to help us get a better sense of how they approach these challenges. One of the things I always like to do with behavioral style questions is actually ask them a question that they don't really want to answer. So instead of asking them, like, tell me about your best boss that you ever worked for, I'd ask them, tell me about a boss that you worked for that you really did not like and you did not get along. Tell me why it is that boss wasn't effective and why you guys didn't mesh. Because one of the first things you learn when you're going into an interview is you're not supposed to bad talk, your previous boss or your previous organization. So now I'm going to ask you to do that, and I'm going to see how you describe that. How are you going to answer that question? Because it's going to give me a better sense of how you're going to problem solve, how you're going to solve these things, where you're put into situations that we're expecting you to be able to think on your feet and be able to come up with good solutions. And then interpersonal skills. Behavior interview questions can assess how employees interact with each other. Tell us about a time where you had a disagreement with a coworker. Some of these kinds of things. It's going to help us understand how they're going to play with others. Because that's one of the hardest things about bringing new talent into the organization, is that can they play effectively with each other in a way that's going to help get work done? Or are they going to constantly bicker? Are they going to constantly fight? Are they going to be doing all this other nonsense that people do when they're behaving badly? And so help you asking questions about how they interact, how they have dealt with situations that maybe things weren't going well, is only going to help us get a better sense of how those interpersonal skills are and what they're going to bring into our organization. So what I've done here is I've several big categories around behavioral questions, and you can all download this presentation so you can have them. So I'm not going to read through them all, but I do want to kind of touch on why these themes are big, because it should be pretty self-evident. But like task authority delegation. Describe a time you managed a project through the end. What was the project? What was the outcome? How did you delegate tasks effectively? Especially with supervisory positions, being able to understand whether or not they can effectively delegate is a critical skill. Because we all know that people that say, I'm a perfectionist, what they're saying is they can't delegate. If you're a perfectionist, it means that you don't trust other people to be able to do things, so you have to do it yourself. And so being able to understand how someone who's coming into a supervisory role, how they delegate tasks, how they assign work, is only going to help you understand how effective they're going to be as a supervisor. Customer service, critical. Whether we're talking about internal stakeholders or external stakeholders, that ability to deliver good customer service in a way that's effective is going to definitely not only show how this person is, but also is going to reflect on how your organization deals with things. So describe a time you managed a complex customer complaint. How did your employee initially handle it? Why was it handed over to you? How did you resolve the problem, right? We're trying to get a better sense of how they're going to deal with people. And so that way we get a better sense of how they're going to deal with our people, whether it's internal or our customers, how they're going to be able to interact with those people. problem solving. We've already talked on this a little bit, but really what we want to know is we want to be able to see how they go about solving problems. Because if we're going to put them, especially in some kind of a management or supervisory role, guess what? We expect them to solve problems, right? We don't expect them to come to us with those problems. That's why we're hiring them, so they can solve these things, right? And whether maybe it's a single, subject matter expert that we're hiring, in a, that's not a supervisory role, we still want to understand how they're going to process some of this information, because we don't want them coming to us all the time because they can't solve those problems, right? So can you tell me about the last problem you had to solve at work? What was the issue? How did you resolve it? Let's get into this, And again, sometimes what I'll do is I'll turn this on its head and I'll say, can you tell me about the last time you had a problem that you had to solve at work and the solution you came up with didn't work? Why didn't it work? What did you do differently next time? Again, let's have them talk about negative experiences, not just positive, so we can really get a sense of who they really are and how they're going to handle those types of situations for us in the future. Motivation and values, really, really critical. As a compensation person, I talk about motivation all the time. Like, how are we going to get people to do the things we want them to do? Are we going to use a carrot or are we going to use a stick, right? Are we going to use honey or are we going to use salt? Like, how are we going to get them to do those kinds of things? Understanding this candidate and what motivates them and what they place value on is going to help you get a better understanding as their supervisor on how you're going to need to motivate them in the workplace. So describe when you faced a significant obstacle as a manager. How did your personal values and motivation guide your approach to overcoming that challenge, right? We're really trying to get an understanding of how they do things, what they value, and what they're willing to do to get things accomplished. So motivation and value is a really big thing, and that ties right into ethics and integrity. Describe a time you had to make a decision you considered unethical. What was the decision? How did you approach it? How did you go through with it? Trying to understand how somebody thinks, how somebody responds in times of stress, in times of busyness. That's only going to help you as a supervisor not only supervise this person, but it's also going to help you get expectations on how they're going to respond when you're not there and how they're going to do things when you're not around. So ethics, integrity, really, really critical. Those soft skills, really, really important to helping us understand who that candidate is, because that's the whole goal. Every interview, whether you're the candidate or you're the interviewing panel, all that is an opportunity to build connection. If you can build a connection as the candidate to that interview panel, your odds go increasingly up as to getting that job. As an interview panel, if you feel like that candidate is making a connection with you, if they're being open and honest and transparent, it's only going to fill you with more confidence that you know who this candidate is. It may not be the right person for the job, but you're going to know who they are, and that's going to help you make a better decision as a hiring manager. Leadership and management, especially for the supervisor positions, how do they lead? How do they manage people? This kind of goes back to how we delegate, right? Describe a time you led your team through a period of significant change. What was the change? How did you support your employees? What was the outcome? We know in our business that change happens all the time. It happens at an increasingly fast rate. I teach a whole class at the University of Denver all about HR change management. I mean, we spend 10 weeks talking about how to manage change. So making sure that we're bringing in people into our organization that can effectively lead people through times of change where things are moving fast, where things are being different than how they've been done before, is going to help us get a better sense of how effectively they're going to be as a supervisor and manager in our organization. Last thoughts on questions. Make sure you're using the job description for the basis for all of your questions. All your questions are right there in the job description. As somebody who writes job descriptions every day for my organization, I always tell people this is the foundation. So when you're writing your interview questions, you should be looking at the knowledge, the skills, and the abilities that somebody has to have to do that job and building your questions around that. Because if they don't have that knowledge, and that's probably job-based, right, that they can't do the job. If they don't have the skills, which again is probably experience, they probably can't do the job. And if they don't have the ability to take those things, that knowledge and skills, and do things with it, they're not going to be effective in that role. So use your job descriptions to build those questions, because that's the crux of what we're trying to get to. If we're asking questions that don't relate to the job, it's impractical and be unlawful. I remember one time we were interviewing for a position down in our real estate group, and the supervisor handed me their questions, and I was like, all right, let's see what we got here. And the last question was, are you a cat or a dog person? And I kid you not, I just kind of like paused, and I was like, why are we asking this question? Like, well, we just want to see how they're going to interact with the group. We want to see how they respond to that question. And I was like, no, you can't ask that question. And they were so mad at me. And I was like, no, it is not job related. It's like, tell me about the last book you read. This is not book club. We are trying to find out whether this candidate can do this job. We're not interested whether they're team Jacob or team Edward, right? We're interested in, can they do the job? Are they going to be effective? And are they going to contribute to our organization and our work group? So all the questions we ask candidates have to be related to the job. And then lastly, limit the number of questions to your allotted time. I don't know how many times I'll sit down with the hiring manager and they'll have a list of like 20 questions. And I'm like, we only have 45 minutes for this interview. And they're like, oh, I know, we'll just get through as many as we can. No. We're not doing that. We're going to ask everyone the same questions. So that means we need to ask the right number of questions, and we need to make sure that we're giving our candidates time to ask us questions. Because one of the things we have to keep in mind is they're interviewing us just like we're interviewing them. Because if they walk out of that interview and they're like, nope, not my place, I don't want to work there, that's important. Because we don't want to hire that person because they don't want to work for us either, right? So we want to make sure that we're limiting our time, making sure that our questions are appropriately, we have enough questions that are going to get to what we need to know, but at the same time, make sure we give our candidates opportunities to ask us questions. Because when I coach candidates, when I coach people that are going in for interviews and they ask me, can you give me any advice? The first thing I always tell people, if they ask me for advice on going in for an interview, the first thing is they ask you about your strengths and weaknesses. Do not tell them that it's lying in interviews, because that's never the good thing, right? That's a joke, by the way. No, the thing I always tell people when they're going into an interview is go in, be open, be friendly, be transparent, and ask good questions at the end. It was funny. My oldest son is 15, and he had his first job interview last summer, and he was going in and he was like, what do I need to know? And I said, well, this is what you need to know. You need to be able to answer questions. I said, when you walk in, you need to ask them their names. You need to remember their names. So when Bill asks you a question, you can look at Bill and say, thank you for asking me that, Bill. That way you're building that connection. And he's like, okay, I can do that. I said, and the last thing is you need to have good questions. He's like, what do you mean? I said, well, ask him a question that's going to be important, that's going to be meaningful, that's going to help send them the message that you're serious about this job. He's like, well, what's a good question? I said, tell me about what other people that have done this job, how it's helped them in their careers later on in the organization. He's like, oh, that's a really good one. I'm like, yes, but that's what we want to do. We want to make sure we're giving our candidates time so they can ask us good questions, so we can get an assessment of them about how serious they are about being in this role. The only other thing I would say, and I didn't put this on the slide, but I did want to talk about this, is when we have structured interviews, when we have those listed questions, we also need to make sure we're freshening up those questions from time to time. We had a candidate once who somehow had gotten the list of the questions ahead of time, and the panel came out and said, hey, we have a problem. I said, what's going on? They said, they knew all the answers to all the questions. And I was like, well, that's kind of the idea, right? We kind of want them to have all the answers to the questions. I mean, that's kind of what we're striving for. And he said, yeah. He said, but you know that new question that we added 2 days ago that we decided we were going to ask? I said, yeah. I said, when we asked that question, they totally blanked. Like they were so surprised and they didn't know how to answer it. I'm like, that wasn't that hard a question to answer. And they're like, I know. I'm like, oh. So freshen up your questions. Make sure that you're not using the same ones, because you don't want those questions to fall into the wrong hands. All right, so let's talk a little bit about optimizing the interview experience. And this is really about branding and making sure that the interview experience for our candidates is good. And I think one of the most important things is that interviews are really oftentimes the first time a candidate is learning about your company, learning about your organization. You're the front door. So we want to make sure that we're leaving them with a good impression, that they're like, wow, I really want to work for that organization. They seem really, really nice. Lots of times I always encourage people to give gifts to interviewers when they're coming in. When I worked for the water department, we had water bottles. People would come in and be like, hey, so glad that you're here. You can sit right here. We got about 10 minutes until the next interview. Here's a water bottle. The water fountain's right over there if you want to fill it up so you have water. And it made total sense because we are a water company and we don't want people using bottled water. So now they have a water bottle that has our name on it. We don't have to have water provided in the interview room because we've already given them water. It was such an easy little thing, such a good tie-in. And I got the idea because I was talking to a guy who was an HR manager for a wine, a vineyard in Napa. And he said, when we have people come in, we give them a bottle of wine. And I was like, well, heck yeah. Like, I want to go interview there, like at least on Fridays. But, think about what you want to give people that's going to give them that good impression of your organization. And then make sure the people that are interacting with those candidates reflect the company values. If you got Susie at the front desk and Susie is a downer, right? Like no one likes to talk to Susie because she's always grumpy. She's always got drama going on. She should not be the first person our candidates are meeting. That is not a good representation of our organization. We want whoever's got that front desk to reflect our values, make sure that that candidate feels comfortable, that they, feel like this is a good place to be. And lots of times I would ask the receptionist after the interviews, what did you think of, Mary? And they'd say, oh, she was super nice. She asked me questions. I mean, I'm just trying to get more information, get more input. So that way I'm making a good decision. With your interview panels, keep things to keep in mind for your interview panels. They should include people from both sexes. And if you have the ability, a minority. That way we're making sure there's no bias. That way we're making sure that people feel like the interview panel reflects them, right? That's only going to help them get a better sense of who we are as an organization. Meet with the interview prior to the interview. Go over the questions. Talk about the process. Have the supervisor describe what it is that they really need from this position. So that way everybody on the interview panel understands what the goal is. Here's the task. Here's what we're trying to find. That way everybody has a real good idea. If Bill says this is what he needs, this is what we're looking for. Determine the order, who's going to be asking the questions. Just get that figured out ahead of time so that way it's not awkward. And that way people get into the flow and it just flows a little smoother. And then during the interview, the panel should maintain consistency and fairness to ensure a good candidate experience. And this is, I think, one of the hardest things. If I ask the candidate a question, I want to listen to them, but I also want to take notes. So that's always the struggle, right? So typically what I'll do is I'll ask the question and I'll listen to how they respond. I'll nod my head a couple times, and then I'll start writing down some notes. So that way they're getting that I'm engaged with them. I'm creating eye contact. At the same time, I'm writing notes so that way they know that what they're telling me is important, that I want to make sure I don't miss. Punctuality. Do not be late to the interview. Do not have your interview panel show up late. We want people to feel like they are important. If the candidate is in the room and somebody comes in and says, oh, I'm so sorry, I had to take a call, that doesn't make it sound like they're important. So make sure your interview panel know that we're not going to bring anybody in until we're all here and we're ready to go. And that if you slow us down, we all know we got to keep those trains running on time. If somebody slows us down, we're going to be behind the whole rest of the day. So we want to make sure that we try to be as punctual and timely as possible. Panelists should practice active listening during the interview to ensure engagement, clear understanding during the interview, asking follow-up questions, making sure that they understand exactly what the candidate's telling them, so that way the candidate feels heard. Encourage a candidate to ask questions, promote transparency, a two-way dialogue. I've talked a little bit about that already. And lastly, don't bail out candidates. And I see this happen all the time. You'll ask them a behavioral style question, and they'll sit there and they'll sit back and they'll think and they'll go, well, and lots of times they'll look up because they're activating their brain, right? It's a normal human response that we look up. And there'll be that awkward silence. And somebody will say, well, what about like this? Or give me maybe something like this. They're bailing them out. Don't do that. Let them process, let them think, and then let them respond. Awkward silences are totally fine. It's totally okay. I remember one time we did an interview and this gal, she came in and she had, like a little portfolio, and we'd ask a question and she had like all kinds of notes, and she was like thumbing through them, and then she would tell us, we were asked a behavioral style question, and I realized afterwards she had written down different answers to different questions that she expected. So that way, and then she would check them off as we asked the question to make sure that she got all the information she wanted to share with us to us. It was super interesting. I'd never seen anyone do that before, but what it told me was this gal is very organized. She's very precise, and she cares. She wants to make sure she's getting us the right information. So don't bail out candidates when you ask them a question and it's tough and they're struggling to come up with an answer. Let them struggle. That's the whole point of this. We want them to struggle so that way we can see how they process that and what comes out of the end of it. And then lastly, let's talk about scoring the interview. Create a standardized scoring rubric, right? And have your interviewers individually score the candidate based on the interview. Don't do it right after the candidate, don't do it all together. Because what happens is us extroverts, and I place myself happily in that group, we will talk and try to convince you that our answer is the right one. Let everybody do that individually. This will help limit judgments based on subjectivity, creating a clearer candidate evaluation. Typically like something 1 to 5 with some different categories is an easy way to kind of score that. Like I said, scoring should be done without discussion after each interview. So give yourself time. If you're going to do interviews every hour, that means the questions need to be done after 40 minutes. You need to give the candidate 10 minutes to ask you questions. And then you need 10 minutes to score things, get a glass of water, answer an email, whatever people need to do in between the interviews. Make sure you're being aware of people's time and respectful of that. And then after scoring is complete, get everybody together, talk about the candidates, talk about the scores, make sure that we're basing our decisions on that data. If everybody ranked Mary as a 5, why are we picking Bill? Because I don't understand that. That doesn't make any sense. Well, I just had a better feel about Bill. Really? Because you gave him a 3 when we talked about punctuality, right? So use that scoring, make good database decisions. And then lastly, don't fear feedback. Candidates should be surveyed about the application process. When I go in to fill out an application in your organization, at the end of me filling in that application, does it ask me, was this application too long? Was it easy to answer? Did you get a clear understanding of what we're looking for? Ask them some of these questions. That way you can get a better feedback loop on, are we posting good effective job postings? It's only going to help us be better as recruiters if we know about how our candidates are experiencing that application process. When people get hired, 2 weeks after they're hired, we should send them a survey. Tell us about the hiring process. How was the interviews? Did the HR person communicate with you effectively? Did you have any questions that weren't answered? Ask those questions of the candidates while it's still fresh in their mind. And that way it'll help us get a better understanding of what the candidate's experience, coming in as a new hire really was. You can ask about onboarding. You can ask about, their supervisor, all kinds of little questions to help you get a better gauge on how things are going. And then lastly, and this is the tough part, you should be asking those hiring managers about the recruiting process. Ask your hiring manager after every new hire. Tell us about how the recruiter was. Did they keep their deadlines? Did the recruiter communicate effectively with you about the timeline and how things were going to work? Ask those questions. And I know, having done this for years, I know what a pain in the butt hiring managers can be. Trust me, I get it. It's a hard thing to have to deal with some of these people. And they're already our employees. But asking those questions is going to give us important feedback. It's going to help us understand how we can do our jobs better. And if people aren't getting good information, if they're not getting good, clear communication from us, we need to know about it so we can fix it. We don't want to fix it later. We want to fix it as soon as we know about it. We want to make changes so that way, hopefully, that improves. All right, I've been talking for 45 minutes. If you have any questions about the interview process, about predictive interviewing, about any of the types of questions I presented, scenarios, you want to know about, how I got to be so cool, what kind of questions do you guys have for me?
And for anyone who does have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat. We were able to see those, so if you have anything, stick it in there and we'll be able to sort through. In the meantime, as people are typing those out, just a reminder that the recording of this webinar will be available afterwards. So if you want to rewatch it again and see all of this good information, hear it again, process what's going on, then that will be available afterwards. Also, if you want just the presentation file, if you look in the upper right corner of your screen, you'll see a little file section, and you're able to download the presentation there. So if you just want some time to look over everything that's been written, then that is available to you as well.
All right. So Nikki asks, what is a good average amount of time to calculate per interview question to determine the length of the interviews? I think it depends on the type of question. Like if I'm going to ask job-based questions, those are usually going to be a little bit faster unless I'm asking something complex. So typically what I'll try to do is think through behavioral style questions are usually going to take longer. But I would expect probably 5 minutes per question, which is usually why I usually try to keep our questions to 8 to 10 questions, unless there's going to be a lot of factual kind of stuff where they can just kind of give answers to. That's typically the guidelines I use. Usually about 5 minutes per question, and that gives us a chance to ask follow-up questions if they say something that we need to dig a little bit deeper on or needs a little bit better understanding because maybe we didn't understand something. So it's always interesting when you go into these interviews because every group is interesting. I remember I used to do interviews with our IT people, and we'd ask questions, and these were always like remote. This is back, IT was doing remote interviews long before the rest of us. And they'd ask a question about some process, like how would you do this? And they'd listen to the candidate, and I'd watch the IT people, and they'd be shaking their head like, well, these people don't know what they're doing. Why are they doing this way and this? And then we'd get done with the whole interview, and I'd be like, so what do you think of the candidate? And they're like, oh, he's really good. And I was like, but you guys said like you were acting like the answers he was giving you were wrong. And that's when they reminded me that in the IT world, there's lots of different ways to pluck that chicken. Just because they don't do it the same way you do doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong. It helps them understand what knowledge they have, how they go about doing things. And I was like, oh, that helps me get a better understanding because when just by their reactions, I was like, oh, obviously this is not a good candidate. So it's always interesting to see how people, your interview panel, how they respond in those interviews, just to get a better sense of kind of what they're trying to understand too. All right, I see Corin's writing something, so.
And while people are typing, so you said that, obviously it depends on the questions. Is there any solid way that you categorize questions and kind of break it down by time based on that? Like if it's a yes or no question, that's like a minute. If it's a behavioral question, give about 3 for that or anything like that?
Well, the hard part is that sometimes you have talkers, right? And as being a talker, I can attest that, I talk a lot. So if you have a talker in the room, what you thought was only going to take them like 3 or 4 minutes to answer may take them twice that long. And so that's kind of the hard part. You can't, there's not really a hard rule with that. It really just depends on the candidate and how much they're going to share. But typically, 5 minutes per question should give you enough time. And if you're going through the questions and you're going to be done early, you can always ask some follow-up questions, that kind of thing, try to dig in a little bit more. But honestly, there's nothing wrong with an interview going too fast. As someone who sat through full days of interviews, interviewing candidates, that only helps things get back on time. So sometimes if the candidate just doesn't share a lot, you can't really get a lot out of them, and you end up done early, well, it is what it is, right? Maybe that candidate isn't the right person because maybe you didn't feel like they were being open and transparent with you. Amy asks, what are your thoughts on situational questions? How would you handle X situation for interpersonal skills or problem-solving skills? I've had hiring managers in the past want to use a lot of situational style questions for various soft skills, and I believe behavior style questions solicit more helpful responses. And I think you're absolutely right, Amy. I think take those situational skills and turn them into behavioral questions, so that way you can get a better sense of how they would respond. So if, let's say we're talking about a GPS coordinator, so they do GPS coordinates, and maybe the hiring manager wants to ask them about, they're trying to upload their GPS coordinates and it's not going into the system, how they would, troubleshoot and fix that, while they're out in the field. Well, let's turn that into a behavioral style question. And what you could say is, tell me about a time that you were using technology and it didn't work effectively, and you had to, while you're out in the field, how would you respond to that? A good example might be, and then give them that situation that the supervisor just gave you. So that way the supervisor feels heard, the hiring manager feels heard, but at the same time, you're turning it into a behavioral style question to kind of dig into a little bit more of those past experiences. I think the thing that people need to remember when it comes to behavioral style questions is we don't want it to be theoretical. We don't want to say, well, if I were in a situation like that, I would do this. No, no, no. We're not interested in what you would do. We want to know what you have done. We want to know what your past experiences are. So if you catch somebody doing that, because that's sometimes what they'll try to do, that's where you have to follow up and say, I understand what you're saying, but have you had that actual experience where you've had to deal with that? Dig into that, push that back onto them to give you actual experiences. So that way you can get an idea. And they may answer and say, no, I actually haven't ever had that. I've seen other people have it. And then you could ask them a little bit about what they saw. But we're really, when we ask those behavioral style questions, we're really trying to gauge their experience in those situations, because we're really trying to figure out if that past behavior is going to predict what that future behavior is going to be. So good question. Corin says, is there a way to work past first impressions that I can give a summary to my panel? So I'm trying to get an understanding of what you're asking here, Corin. So I think sometimes, and don't get me wrong, I've been in interviews where somebody comes in and in the first 5 minutes, you're like, this is not the person. This is not the person. And I've got to be here for another 40 minutes because I already know this is not the right person. It happens sometimes, right? But what I always try to do is, and try to do this as much as you can, is make sure that the candidate feels as comfortable as they can. Like, and by that I mean is make sure that you're creating that open, inviting environment. There's nothing wrong with a little bit of small talk before you jump into the questions. You can ask them, hey, how was your drive here? They're doing that construction. That can be a little tricky. Let them get some of those early nerves out. Let them start to feel like they're talking to a person and not this, execution panel that's going to determine their fate. Like, let them feel safe. Let them feel comfortable as much as you can. So that way the candidate can get past those nerves and can really start to open up and be transparent with you. Because you're absolutely right. Like, nerves can play a huge role. And I think as the HR people, the people that are doing the talent, we see this all the time. And so I think part of being good at, talent acquisition and being good at interviews really comes down to, can you make the candidate feel safe that they're going to get past their nerves and start to really open up and tell you who they are, right? And I use humor to do that because, everybody except for my wife thinks I'm funny, but you have to figure out what your style is. How are you going to make that candidate feel safe and feel like they can open up and that it's okay? Like, they can take a breath. Everything's going to be fine. We're all here to do the same thing, and find out. And so usually what I do is I usually start off with some small talk, I see you used to work over, at Denver Water. Did you ever work with so-and-so? Oh yeah, I used to work with him too. Yeah, he's a character, do something like that just to kind of help them feel a little bit more at ease. So that way they start to feel a little bit more comfortable and they start to hopefully feel safe enough that they can get past those nerves. Any other questions that I can answer on interviews? All right, Mackenzie, either I have blown them away or they have all put me on mute, one of the two.
No, I'm sure that they're all listening attentively, but we are coming up on time, so unless we have any last-minute questions, that's going to bring today's webinar to a close. Brian, thank you so much for presenting today. That was a lot of wonderful information, and I'm sure it was very helpful to our members. If anyone wants to learn more about CPS HR and their partnership with the pool, you're more than welcome to visit our website at www.cscpool.org/HR-consulting. Once again, Brian, thank you so much, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Thanks, everybody.